I always thought coming home would feel like an arrival, like the final exhale after years of holding my breath. But when I limped up the cracked front steps of the house on Cedar Lane, the air felt heavier than I remembered. Even the paint on the porch rails was peeling away in long, flaking strips, as if the place itself was tired of pretending everything was fine. My name is Daniel Brooks, and for almost 12 years, I worked as a civil engineer on overseas projects most people have never heard of. Ports in Djibouti, roadways in Kosovo, dams in remote provinces of Thailand. My hands had traced the blueprints of cities I would never live in, and my shoulders had borne the responsibility of supporting the people I loved most. Every month, sometimes every 2 weeks, I wired home nearly everything I earned: the money that kept the lights on, the money that paid the taxes, the money that Mom used to buy the extra things she said made life worth living. And now, standing here with my leg bound in a rigid cast up to my thigh, I felt like a stranger to the place I'd worked so hard to preserve. I'd called ahead to say I was coming. No one offered to pick me up at the airport. No one asked if I needed help carrying my duffel bag or managing the uneven path up to the door. I told myself maybe they were busy. Maybe they were overwhelmed. I held on to that thought like a splinter under the skin, painful but familiar. I pushed the door open, expecting at least a flicker of warmth. Instead, my mother stood in the center of the living room with her arms folded across her chest, her gaze fixed on the bulky cast. The TV murmured some talk show behind her, the volume so low it sounded like a distant argument I'd wandered into by mistake. "You're finally back," she said, her voice stripped of any welcome. "And look at you. You're just a burden now." That word, burden, landed harder than I thought it could. My throat tightened as though I'd swallowed a stone. I'd pictured this moment 1,000 times in those empty hotel rooms abroad, imagining her tears, her relief, her gratitude. Not this, not the clinical dismissal in her eyes. I shifted my weight, feeling the screws in my femur ache with every movement. The injury had come at the end of a contract in Sarajevo when scaffolding collapsed under my feet. Months of recovery followed. Months I spent alone in a place that smelled like antiseptic and boiled cabbage, waiting for the call that never came. I set my bag down slowly. The fabric brushed the scratched oak floorboards, the same ones my father used to polish until they gleamed. My father, gone 5 years now, would have wrapped me in a hug that made me feel 10 years old again. He would have said, "Welcome home, son," in that steady baritone that carried both pride and relief. But he wasn't here. Just my mother, with her thin lips pressed into a line of judgment, her hands clutching her cardigan like armor. I looked around the room at the things my paychecks had bought: new curtains in the kitchen window, the updated refrigerator humming in the corner, the roof repaired after the last hurricane season. I thought about the wire transfers I sent every month without fail, no matter how tired or lonely I felt. A burden. The word echoed again, sour and unyielding. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of the folded paper. The deed, my insurance policy, my proof that I hadn't been sending money just to be discarded when it was convenient. I didn't take it out yet. Not then. There was a time for that, and it wasn't the first minute I'd stepped inside. But as I met my mother's eyes, I knew it would come soon. Because this house, this place she called hers, was something she'd lived in at my expense. Every board and brick had been kept standing because I'd sacrificed years I could never get back. I inhaled slowly, catching the faint smell of lemon cleaner and old grief. I realized with a quiet certainty that nothing was ever going to be the same again. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of my own sacrifice, I decided I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I didn't sleep much that first night back. My old room still had the same crooked shelf over the bed, the same faded blue comforter my father gave me the year I graduated college. But everything felt smaller than I remembered, as if the walls had shrunk to match the narrow expectations my mother seemed to have for me. I lay awake listening to the house creak and settle around me, memories rising uninvited. When I was a boy, this place was a sanctuary. My father was a tall man with calloused hands and a deep laugh that made the windows rattle. He'd worked for the county water department, patching pipes and inspecting hydrants, never complaining about the long hours. My mother back then was softer. She kept the house immaculate, and every Sunday she'd bake cornbread so sweet it stuck to your teeth. They taught me the value of work early. I was expected to mow the yard, rake the leaves, help fix whatever broke. My father used to say, "Nothing stays standing without care, Danny. Not a house, not a family." I believed him. When I turned 16, I got my first job hauling lumber for the hardware store down on Walnut Street. Every Friday, I'd hand over most of my paycheck to my mother. She'd smile and kiss my cheek, and I'd feel proud, like I was helping keep everything together. Even then, I saw how fragile things were. My parents fought about money, about my father's drinking when he was tired or sad, about the bills that piled up in the kitchen drawer. But they never stopped loving each other. Not really. And when my father passed, some small, unremarkable heart attack that stopped everything in its tracks, I saw something change in my mother's face. A tightness that never left. I thought I could fix it. I finished my degree in civil engineering at Purdue, the first Brooks to ever finish college. I took every overseas contract I could, telling myself it was noble to send everything home. My friends back here were buying houses, starting families, going to baseball games and school plays. And me? I was sketching water infrastructure for villages I couldn't pronounce, learning to drink instant coffee in a tin cup, and pretending it was all part of some bigger plan. Every birthday, every Christmas, I called home. The conversations got shorter. My mother's voice, once bright with curiosity, turned clipped, more transactional. She'd ask about the deposit dates and utility bills before she asked about my health. I told myself it was just her way of coping, that she was proud but didn't know how to say it. Lying in my childhood bed, I wondered if I'd been a fool. The last time I was here, 3 years before the accident, I'd found an overdue tax notice tucked under a stack of magazines on the kitchen table. I'd paid it without comment, thinking I was sparing her embarrassment. She'd thanked me, but there was no softness in her eyes. Just the expectation that I'd keep stepping up. In the dark, I reached for my phone and scrolled through old photos. Scaffolding against a bright sky, me in a hard hat with my crew, a picture of my father standing in this very doorway with one hand on my shoulder. He looked proud, like he believed I was building something bigger than myself. I closed my eyes and let the screen go dark. The cast on my leg itched, a dull reminder of everything I'd given up. I had thought coming home would fill the hollow spaces inside me. Instead, it felt like I'd stepped into a mausoleum, something preserved only because I'd kept sending the money to prop it up. I rolled onto my side, careful not to jolt my leg, and listened to the quiet. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd have the conversation I'd been rehearsing since the day I signed the deed over to my own name. Tomorrow, I'd stop pretending this was still the house I grew up in, and accept that it had become something else entirely. Something I might have to take back. Morning came slow, the kind of pale dawn that turns everything the color of old bones. I sat up carefully, wincing as the pressure in my leg throbbed like a second heartbeat. For a moment, I just stared at the familiar ceiling, the water stain in the corner shaped like a lopsided star, and thought about all the years I'd spent picturing this place as home. I hobbled down the hall, one hand trailing along the wallpaper my mother had picked out the year after Dad died. Little blue flowers on a cream background, faded now in the places the sun touched most. I'd paid for that wallpaper, paid for the roof and the furnace and the new gutters, paid for the groceries and the property tax. I'd built this illusion of stability one paycheck at a time, and somehow, I was still the burden. I found my mother in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee. She didn't look up as I came in. The silence spread out between us like something alive. "You hungry?" she asked finally, her voice flat. "No," I said. My stomach felt like a closed fist. She didn't ask about my leg. She didn't ask how long I'd be staying. She just sipped her coffee and kept her eyes fixed on the window as though I might disappear if she refused to look at me directly. I eased myself into a chair. The old oak table was scarred with years of use, knife nicks, water rings, a small burn mark from the time I tried to toast marshmallows over a candle. My father had laughed then, a sound that still echoed in my head. My mother hadn't laughed at all. I took a breath. "Mom," I began, "we need to talk about the house." Her jaw tightened. "Not now." "When then?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because I've been paying for this place for over a decade, and you—" Her gaze snapped to mine, sharp and unblinking. "You did what a son is supposed to do. Support his mother." I swallowed hard. "It wasn't charity, Mom. You asked me to help. I thought—" My throat closed. I had to force the words out. "I thought we were in this together." She set her mug down with a clatter. "Don't turn this into some kind of betrayal, Daniel. You have no idea what it's been like here." "No idea?" My voice cracked on the last word. "I missed Dad's funeral because I was wiring you money to cover the mortgage. I missed his funeral." Her mouth trembled, but she didn't look away. "And I buried him alone." "You think that was easier?" The kitchen felt smaller than it ever had. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, a frantic rhythm I couldn't calm. "I did everything I could," I said softer now. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, sent enough, maybe we could feel like a family again." She crossed her arms over her chest. "And now what? You expect me to thank you for keeping a roof over our heads?" "No," I shook my head. "I expect you to understand that I'm not just something to be used up and discarded. That word you called me, burden—" Her eyes flickered, but she said nothing. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded deed. I set it on the table between us. The paper looked so thin, so ordinary, for something that had cost me so much. "You need to know," I said quietly, "this house is in my name. It has been for 5 years. I kept it that way in case something happened to you, but also because I needed to feel like I still had a place here." For the first time, she looked shaken. Her hands hovered over the deed, but didn't touch it. You put it in your name?" she whispered. I nodded. "After Dad died, when the bank threatened foreclosure, I didn't think you'd want everyone to know. So I signed the paperwork, paid off the debt, and I never said a word because I thought it didn't matter who owned it, as long as we were family." She sank into the chair across from me, her shoulders folding in on themselves. All the years I'd spent believing I was protecting something precious, this house, our relationship, suddenly felt like they'd been built on sand. I watched her face shift through shock, confusion, and something I couldn't name. Maybe regret, maybe just fear. The kettle began to whistle on the stove, shrill and insistent. Neither of us moved to turn it off. In that moment, I realized the first betrayal hadn't been the word she'd thrown at me yesterday. It was this, that somewhere along the way, the house had become more important than the people living in it, that I had given everything to preserve 4 walls and a roof, only to find there was nothing left inside worth saving. After the kettle went quiet, we sat in that heavy silence, both of us too proud, or too afraid, to be the first to say something true. I could see her hands trembling as they rested on the table, and for a moment, I thought she might reach for mine. But she didn't. Instead, she stood up, moved to the sink, and started rinsing her coffee cup as though our entire conversation had been nothing more than a passing annoyance. The water ran loud against the porcelain, and I watched her shoulders hunch, her spine curved like a question mark. I thought about the first time I'd felt truly shut out of this house. It had been right after Dad's funeral. I'd flown in for 2 days, jet-lagged and hollowed out by grief. I tried to help sort through his things, his fishing rods in the shed, his battered flannel jackets. But she'd snapped at me, told me to leave it all alone. She didn't want my help then either. I told myself it was her way of coping, that in time she'd soften. But as the years passed, she seemed to grow harder instead, like stone left out in the weather. I shifted in my chair, wincing as the cast tugged at the tender skin behind my knee. My entire body felt brittle, as if the wrong word would shatter me into pieces. "Mom," I said finally, "I don't want to fight with you." She didn't turn around. "Then don't. But we have to talk about this," I insisted. "About the house. About what happens now." She set the cup down carefully in the sink, then braced her hands on either side of it. "You're home now," she said, her voice dull. "You can stay here while you heal, if that's what you're asking." "That's not what I'm asking," I said. "I'm asking if you understand that things have to change, that I'm not going to keep pretending I don't have a right to decide what happens here." Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were tired, ringed with dark hollows I hadn't noticed before. "You think this is about money, Daniel?" "Isn't it?" I shot back before I could stop myself. "Every time I called, you wanted to talk about the bills, the taxes, what needed fixing. Not once did you ask if I was okay. Not once did you say you missed me." Her mouth worked around words she didn't say. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "I did miss you, but it was easier to pretend you were just away, working, like your father did. Because if I thought about how alone I was—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. I waited, my heart hammering. But she didn't finish the thought. Instead, she dropped her hand and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. I didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like I was failing him, or you. I felt the air go out of my lungs. For a second, I saw her not as the woman who'd called me a burden, but as someone just as lost as I was. Someone who'd built her life around a man who was gone, and a son she could only reach through bank transfers and stilted phone calls. But the tenderness didn't last. She blinked, and the wall came back down. "I won't leave this house," she said firmly. "I don't care whose name is on the deed." "I'm not asking you to," I said, though part of me wondered if that would change someday. "I'm asking you to be honest, to admit that I'm not the problem here." She looked away. "I'm tired, Daniel. We can talk about this later." I almost let her walk out. Almost. But something in me snapped, the part that had been silent for too long. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We're talking about it now." Her gaze swung back to me, sharp again, but this time I didn't flinch. "All these years, I thought I was saving you. But I think we were both just trying to keep from drowning. You behind these walls. Me a world away. And now," she whispered. "Now," I said, "we decide whether this house is going to be the thing that finally destroys what's left of this family." She didn't answer, but for the first time I thought she might be listening. I spent the next few days moving through the house like a ghost. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a memory. Every corner a place where something had been lost. My mother and I spoke in small, brittle exchanges, about groceries, about my medication schedule, about the neighbor's dog that kept getting into her flower beds. But under every word was the same unspoken question: what happens next? I tried to distract myself by sorting through the papers I'd brought with me. Receipts, contracts, letters from the bank, all the proof of what I'd sacrificed to keep this place afloat. Part of me hated that I'd become the kind of man who needed evidence to justify love, but the other part knew that without it, nothing I said would matter. On the third morning, I called Sharon, the attorney who'd handled the property transfer after Dad died. She'd always been kind to me, sending updates overseas when I couldn't be here in person. "Daniel," she said when she picked up, her voice warm, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "Hi, Sharon." I tried to keep my tone steady. "I'm back in town, and I think I need some advice." "About the house?" she asked gently. "About everything," I admitted. We set an appointment for the next day. When I hung up, I felt an unexpected surge of relief, like maybe I wasn't as alone in this as I thought. That afternoon, I found my mother sitting in the living room with the TV turned off, her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, folded into herself. "You went through the papers," she said without looking up. "I did," I said. "I called Sharon." Her jaw tightened. "You're going to throw me out." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not going to do that. But I am going to figure out what comes next, for both of us." For a moment, she looked at me with such raw hurt that I almost apologized, almost told her I'd drop it all if it would bring back the mother I remembered. But that mother was gone, and pretending wouldn't change that. "You think this house is all we have left," she said after a long silence. "But you're wrong." I sank into the chair across from her. "Then what is it we have, Mom? Because it feels like we're just clinging to the wreckage." She closed her eyes. "You were always so much like your father, always trying to fix everything, even things that couldn't be fixed." "Maybe," I said, "but some things need to be faced anyway." She didn't argue, didn't speak at all, and that, more than anything, scared me. Because if she wouldn't fight, then maybe she'd already given up. The next morning, I hobbled into Sharon's office downtown, the cast making every step an exercise in endurance. She ushered me into a chair and poured me a cup of coffee. "You look tired," she said gently. I rubbed a hand over my face. "I am," she nodded. "I read through the file again after you called. You've been carrying this alone a long time." "Too long," I admitted. "You have options," she said. "You can formalize an agreement, have her acknowledge your ownership, set terms for occupancy, even require contributions to upkeep. It doesn't have to be eviction." "I don't want to take her home," I said quickly. "I know," she said. "But you do have to protect yourself. You can't keep pouring everything you have into a place that's breaking you." Her words hit hard because they were true. I'd spent so many years telling myself I was doing the right thing that I never stopped to ask if it was also killing me. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I'm asking," she said, resting a hand briefly on mine. When I got home, I found my mother at the table, the deed unfolded in front of her. She looked up as I came in, her expression weary but clearer than I'd seen in a long time. "I read it," she said simply. "And?" She sighed. "And maybe you were right. Maybe we both were." I eased into the chair across from her, my heart pounding. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "I don't want this house to be what destroys us either." The tension in my chest eased a fraction. For the first time, I felt like we were standing on the same side of something. The following week felt like learning to walk on a leg I'd never trusted. Every day, I balanced the urge to retreat into old patterns against the quiet determination to set things right. My mother and I began speaking more honestly, though the words often came out raw and ragged. One morning, I woke early to find her at the table again, the deed and a pile of unpaid bills spread out before her. She looked up as I entered the kitchen, her eyes ringed with exhaustion but no longer avoiding mine. "I've been thinking," she said, voice hoarse, "about what you said, about how we can't keep pretending this is working." I pulled out a chair and sat down carefully, resting my crutches against the table leg. And maybe it's time we both stopped pretending." She touched the corner of the deed with 2 fingers. "I thought if I just held on to this place it would keep everything from falling apart. Your father, you, me." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the morning sun made the cracked paint glow almost golden. "But it didn't work." I swallowed hard. "It never does," she nodded. "I don't know how to be anything but stubborn." "Me neither," I admitted. We sat in the quiet for a long time, the air between us feeling strangely gentle. No accusations, no hidden barbs. Just the recognition that both of us were tired of fighting. "I talked to Sharon," I said finally. "She thinks we can set up an agreement. Something that acknowledges what's true, but doesn't force you out." Her shoulders slumped. "I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of me anymore." "It's not about that," I said softly. "It's about being honest." about making sure we both have something solid to stand on. She pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly. "I've been so angry," she whispered. "Angry that he left me. Angry that you went so far away. Angry that I couldn't keep everything together." A tear slid down her cheek, and she swiped it away with a trembling hand. "And I took that out on you." I didn't know what to say. For years, I'd longed for her to admit any of this, but hearing it out loud was more painful than I'd expected. "I don't want to fight with you anymore," she said. "Me neither." A silence settled that felt almost like peace. We spent the next few days gathering everything we'd both been avoiding. Receipts, letters, statements. With Sharon's help, we drafted an agreement that recognized my ownership, but guaranteed my mother the right to live here as long as she chose. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a start. A line drawn under all the unspoken debts and disappointments. The day we signed the papers, my mother insisted on going with me to Sharon's office. She wore the same blue dress she'd worn to my father's funeral, her hair pulled back in a neat twist. I watched her hand tremble as she lifted the pen. She glanced at me as though searching for reassurance, and I nodded. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, like we were finally acknowledging the truth neither of us had wanted to face. Afterward, Sharon offered us both coffee. We sat together in her tidy office, steam rising from our cups, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were equals. Two people who had been hurt by the same losses, trying to find a way to forgive each other. That night, back at the house, I lay in bed listening to the old walls creak. But this time, the sound didn't feel like accusation. It felt like something settling into place. The next morning, my mother surprised me. She knocked softly on my bedroom door before I'd even managed to swing my legs over the edge of the bed. "I made breakfast," she said, her voice uncertain. I blinked, caught off guard. "You did?" She nodded. "You need to keep up your strength." Something in my chest loosened. I pushed myself to standing, my cast dragging awkwardly behind me, and followed her down the hall. In the kitchen, 2 plates were set out, scrambled eggs, toast, a little dish of sliced peaches. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said as I sat down, "for everything." I looked at her, and in her face I finally saw the woman who'd once baked cornbread every Sunday, the woman who'd held my hand when I was small and afraid, the woman I'd spent half my life trying to save. "Me too," I said. And for the first time since I came home, I believed it might actually be true. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the house began to change, as if it, too, was relieved we'd finally stopped pretending. My leg healed slowly, each day bringing back a little more strength and a little less pain. I spent mornings doing my prescribed stretches in the living room, the sun cutting bright stripes across the floor, and sometimes I'd catch my mother watching me from the doorway, her expression unreadable but softer than it used to be. We talked more. Not always about the hard things, sometimes just about the weather or the neighbors or the way the azaleas had started blooming early. But every conversation felt like laying a brick in something new, something sturdier than what we'd built before. One evening, as I was organizing the last of the paperwork into neat folders, she came and sat across from me. I looked around the kitchen, the peeling wallpaper, the scuffed cabinets, the mismatched chairs. It wasn't the house I'd dreamed of coming home to. It wasn't the family I'd hoped I'd find waiting. But it was something. Maybe enough. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'll stay." In the days that followed, we began the slow work of rebuilding. I called the contractor to get quotes for repainting the porch. My mother dug out old recipes she hadn't made since I was a boy. We ate dinner together most nights, and sometimes we even managed to laugh. And every evening when I climbed the stairs to my old room, I felt a little less like a stranger. One afternoon, I caught her sorting through a shoebox of old photos in the living room. She looked up, holding out a picture I hadn't seen in years. Me, maybe 12 years old, perched on Dad's shoulders, both of us grinning like fools. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told me everything. That she remembered. That she missed him, too. That somewhere under all the anger and the fear, there was still love. I took the picture and set it on the mantel, right beside the deed. A reminder that neither the house, nor the money, nor all the years we'd spent apart had erased who we were at our best. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the old house breathe around me, I realized something had shifted. We weren't healed, not completely, but we were no longer pretending to be something we weren't. And for the first time since my father died, I felt hopeful. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the azaleas along the fence had burst into bloom, pink and white blossoms that almost glowed in the evening light. I started sitting out on the porch most afternoons, propping my leg on a spare chair while the fresh paint dried around me. The air smelled of new beginnings. Fresh lumber, damp soil, the faint sweetness of cut grass. My mother joined me sometimes, a glass of iced tea balanced carefully in her hand. We didn't always talk. Sometimes it was enough to sit in companionable silence, watching the world soften back into color after a long, gray winter. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, she shifted in her chair and cleared her throat. "I was thinking," she began, voice tentative, "that maybe you could stay on a little longer. Not because you have to, but because you want to." I looked over at her, studying the lines on her face, the way her mouth pressed tight when she was afraid of the answer. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I did want to stay. Not out of guilt or obligation, but because this was still my home, whether or not I'd been brave enough to claim it. "I think I'd like that," I said. She let out a shaky breath, and something unknotted between us. In the following weeks, we fell into a new routine. I helped her catalog old photographs and pack up boxes of things she no longer needed. She started sorting the kitchen cabinets, shaking her head at the clutter she'd collected over the years. Each small act felt like a quiet apology, a way to say, "I'm sorry," without the words. One afternoon, we found a box of letters in the attic, some from my father to her during their first years of marriage, some from me, mailed back when I was working on my earliest projects overseas. She read them with a hand pressed to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks, and when she passed them to me, I felt like we'd both been given a chance to start over. "I forgot how proud he was of you," she whispered, her fingers trembling on the thin paper. "Of us." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. The house didn't feel so heavy after that. The room seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old habits flared and we lapsed into silence, but there was a softness to it now. A mutual understanding that we'd wasted too many years trying to protect each other by pushing each other away. One morning, I woke early and watched the sunrise from the front steps. The sky was streaked with gold and lavender, the neighborhood just beginning to stir. I thought about the life I'd built overseas, the cities I'd helped shape, the colleagues who had become my makeshift family. And I thought about the life I'd left behind here, waiting for me all along. I'd spent so long believing my worth was measured by what I could send home, by how much I could provide. But sitting there, breathing in the cool morning air, I understood something my father had tried to teach me. That legacy isn't measured in deeds or bank statements. It's measured in what we choose to build with the people we love, and whether we have the courage to keep building even after everything falls apart. That afternoon, I called Sharon one last time. We talked about the final details of the agreement, about transferring certain utilities into my name, about creating a trust to ensure my mother could stay here as long as she wished. It wasn't a conversation about ownership anymore. It was about partnership, about finding a way to honor the years we'd both given to this place without letting it define us. When I hung up, I felt lighter. Not because the house was finally mine, but because I no longer needed it to prove anything. To her, or to myself. Later that evening, as I stood in the living room looking at the photograph of my father with his arm around my shoulders, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not the brittle peace of denial, but the honest kind. The kind you earn by facing what hurt you and choosing to love anyway. I turned to my mother, who was straightening a stack of old magazines by the fireplace, and for the first time in a long time I smiled without reservation. "Thank you," I said quietly. She looked up, puzzled. "For what?" "For still being here," I said. "For trying." Her eyes glistened and she nodded. And in that small moment, I realized this was the true inheritance my father had left us. Not just the house, but the stubborn, tender, complicated love that kept bringing us back to each other, no matter how far we'd wandered.